Imagine a scene straight out of a Hollywood blockbuster, where the line between reality and fiction blurs into a cloud of dust and adrenaline. It is a quiet Sunday morning in France, and the air is thick with the lazy heat of summer. Suddenly, the silence is shattered by the deafening roar of rotor blades slicing through the sky. This is not a movie set, nor is it a military drill, but a brazen act of defiance against the state. In the heart of a high-security facility, a notorious criminal is about to vanish into thin air. The world watches in stunned disbelief as a helicopter descends into a prison courtyard. This event would trigger one of the most massive manhunts in European history. The man at the center of this audacious plot is Redoine Faid, a figure who has become a legend in the French underworld. Known to the public and the press as the writer or the king of escape, Faid is not your typical gangster. He is charming and articulate and possesses a deep obsession with cinema that influences every move he makes. He views his life as a screenplay and his crimes as the action sequences that drive the plot forward. Born in the gritty suburbs north of Paris, he rose from a petty thief to the most wanted man in France. His career is defined by a series of high-stakes robberies and impossible prison breaks. Faid has always been open about his inspirations, citing movies like Heat and Reservoir Dogs as his textbooks for criminal enterprise. He once famously approached director Michael Mann at a film festival to tell him that his movies were his technical advisors. This blurring of art and crime is what makes Faid so dangerous and yet so fascinating to the public. He studies the pacing and the logistics of bank heists on the silver screen and translates them into terrifying reality. His philosophy is that if it can work for Robert De Niro in a film, then it can work for him in the streets of Paris. The story of his rise begins in the concrete housing projects of Creil, a town located just north of the French capital. It was here in the 1980s and 90s that Faid learned the trade of banditry. The environment was tough and opportunities were scarce, leading many young men into a life of crime. However, Faid was different because he had a vision and a desire for notoriety that exceeded the ambitions of his peers. He organized attacks on armored trucks with military precision, using explosives and heavy weaponry. These were not random acts of violence, but carefully choreographed operations that left police forces baffled. By the late 1990s, Faid had established himself as a major player in organized crime. He spent years evading capture and living the high life on the proceeds of his robberies. However, the law eventually caught up with him, and he spent a significant portion of his adult life behind bars. It was during these periods of incarceration that he began to plan his most spectacular feats. Prison was not a deterrent for him, but rather a temporary pause where he could refine his strategies. He wrote an autobiography during one stint in jail, detailing his rise and fall, which only added to his celebrity status. The first time Faid shocked the world with an escape was in 2013 from the Sequedin prison near the Belgian border. In that incident, he did not use a helicopter, but instead used dynamite to blast his way through 5 heavy prison doors. He took 4 wardens hostage, using them as human shields to ensure his safe passage to a getaway car. The sheer violence and audacity of that escape cemented his reputation as a man who could not be caged. He spent 6 weeks on the run before being captured in a hotel room, but the seed had been planted. Security officials knew that no prison could truly hold him. After his recapture, authorities were determined to lock him away for good. He was moved to the Roe South Francilian Penitentiary Center, a modern fortress designed to be escape-proof. The facility is located southeast of Paris and is equipped with state-of-the-art surveillance and security measures. Faid was placed in isolation and his movements were strictly monitored. The administration believed that by cutting him off from the general population and watching him constantly, they could neutralize the threat. They did not count on his ability to inspire loyalty and orchestrate complex plans from within a solitary cell. On the morning of July 1st, 2018, the conditions were perfect for a plan that had been months in the making. Faid was in the visiting room, meeting with his brother Brahim. The visiting room was situated in a part of the prison complex that was supposed to be secure, but had a fatal flaw. The courtyard adjacent to the building did not have anti-helicopter nets installed. It was an oversight that seems impossible in hindsight given the profile of the inmate, but it was the key to the entire operation. While Faid chatted with his brother, a small commando team was already in the air. The operation began at a small flying club in Fontenay-Tressigny, where two men posing as students waiting for a flight lesson hijacked a helicopter. They took the flight instructor hostage and forced him to fly towards the prison. The pilot was terrified as the men brandished assault rifles and gave him specific coordinates. This was not a random hijacking, but a calculated move to secure a vehicle capable of vertical entry and extraction. The pilot later recounted the cold professionalism of the hijackers, who seemed to know exactly what they were doing and where they were going. As the helicopter approached the row prison, the noise of the engine alerted the guards, but it was already too late to react effectively. The aircraft hovered over the complex and descended rapidly into the courtyard of honor. This was the only area within the prison walls that was spacious enough for a landing and lacked the overhead netting. The precision of the landing was crucial, as the rotors had only inches of clearance from the prison walls. Inside the visiting room, Faid likely heard the sound he had been waiting for and prepared himself for the sprint to freedom. Two men dressed in black from head to toe and wearing balaclavas jumped out of the helicopter the moment it touched the ground. They were armed with Kalashnikov assault rifles and carried heavy-duty angle grinders. They also threw smoke bombs to obscure the vision of the guards in the watchtowers and create confusion. The scene was chaotic, with alarms blaring and smoke filling the courtyard. The guards were unarmed, as is standard in French prisons, to prevent inmates from seizing weapons, and they could only watch in horror as the commandos advanced. The commandos wasted no time and ran towards the door leading to the visiting rooms. They used the angle grinder to slice through the locks and metal barriers with practiced speed. Sparks flew as the metal gave way, allowing them to breach the secure perimeter in seconds. This was a team that had clearly rehearsed the operation and knew the layout of the prison intimately. They moved with the efficiency of a special forces unit, ignoring the shouts and alarms around them. Their only goal was to reach the target and extract him before armed police could arrive. Inside the visiting room, the situation was tense, but Faid remained calm. When the door burst open and his rescuers appeared, he simply stood up and walked out. There was no hesitation and no wasted movement. His brother Brahim was left behind in the visiting room, stunned by the sudden turn of events. Faid joined the commandos, and they ran back towards the waiting helicopter. The entire extraction from the moment the helicopter landed to the moment Faid stepped on board took less than 10 minutes. It was a masterclass in timing and execution. The helicopter lifted off amidst the swirling smoke and dust, carrying the fugitive away from the prison. The guards in the watchtowers finally opened fire, but the aircraft was already out of range. They watched as the machine banked sharply and disappeared over the prison walls, heading into the open countryside. The authorities were left scrambling to organize a pursuit, but the head start was significant. The plan included multiple switch points to throw off the police and make tracking difficult. The helicopter landed a few kilometers away in the Ganes area, near Charles de Gaulle Airport. The pilot was released physically unharmed, but in a state of shock. The commandos and Faid set fire to the interior of the helicopter to destroy any DNA evidence before abandoning it. They then switched to a black Renault Megane that was waiting for them. This transition from air to ground was the first layer of their escape strategy, designed to confuse the police who would be looking for an aircraft. The burning helicopter sent a plume of black smoke into the sky, marking the start of the next phase. A massive manhunt was immediately launched with over 3,000 police officers and gendarmes mobilized across the region. Checkpoints were set up on major highways and borders were put on high alert. The French Interior Minister made a public statement vowing to catch the fugitive and bring him to justice. The media went into a frenzy, broadcasting the story of the spectacular escape on a loop. For the public, it was a mixture of fear and fascination, as the king of escape had done it again. The getaway car was found later that day in a shopping center parking lot in Aulnay-sous-Bois. It had also been set on fire, continuing the pattern of destroying evidence. From there, the trail went cold. Investigators believed that Faid and his accomplices had switched to a third vehicle, likely a utility van, to blend in with commercial traffic. The police were racing against time, knowing that every hour that passed allowed Faid to travel further or dig deeper into hiding. The pressure on the investigators was immense. Detectives began to piece together the logistics of the escape. They analyzed the flight path of the helicopter and interviewed the pilot extensively. They also scrutinized the visitor's log at the prison and the background of Faid's brother. Brahim was taken into custody for questioning, but he claimed to have no prior knowledge of the plot. The police suspected that the operation required significant funding and outside help, possibly from organized crime networks that Faid had maintained contact with. Weeks turned into months, and despite the massive resources deployed, Faid remained elusive. There were sightings reported all over France and even in neighboring countries, but most turned out to be false leads. The police focused their attention on Faid's home turf in the Oise region north of Paris. They theorized that unlike other fugitives who flee to South America or Spain, Faid might choose to hide in plain sight among the people and places he knew best. This theory would eventually prove to be correct. The breakthrough in the investigation came from a combination of old-fashioned detective work and modern technology. Police had identified a potential support network in the Creole area. They began monitoring specific individuals who were known associates of Faid. Surveillance teams watched apartments and tracked mobile phone signals, hoping for a mistake. The break came when they noticed a car with false license plates that seemed to be moving between safe houses. This vehicle became the primary focus of the surveillance operation. One evening, surveillance officers spotted a figure exiting the suspicious vehicle, dressed in a full burqa. The burqa is a traditional garment that covers the entire body and face, leaving only a mesh screen for the eyes. While it is a religious garment, the police suspected it was being used as a disguise. The way the person walked and their stature did not match that of a woman. This observation led the police to believe that Faid was hiding under the heavy fabric moving right under their noses. The police tracked the figure to a fourth-floor apartment in a public housing project in the Moulin district of Creole. It was ironic that the man who had escaped a high-security fortress was now hiding in the very neighborhood where he grew up. The apartment belonged to a young woman who was loosely connected to Faid's circle. The police decided to wait and observe to confirm their suspicions and identify any other accomplices who might be in the apartment. They needed to be sure before launching a raid. Thermal cameras and listening devices were used to monitor the apartment. The police detected the presence of multiple people inside. They waited for the optimal moment to strike, ensuring that they could capture everyone without a standoff or a hostage situation. The memory of Faid's previous violent escape was fresh in their minds, and they wanted to avoid a shootout in a densely populated residential building. The operation had to be surgical and overwhelming. On October 3, 2018, 3 months after the helicopter escape, the police made their move. In the early hours of the morning, heavily armed tactical units surrounded the building. They breached the door of the apartment with a battering ram and flooded the rooms with light and commands. Inside, they found Redoine Faid sleeping in a bedroom. He was taken completely by surprise and did not have time to reach for a weapon. The king of escape was back in custody. Alongside Faid, the police arrested his brother Ratchet and 2 other men who were believed to be part of the commando team. They also found wigs and the burqa that had been used as a disguise. A revolver was found within reach of where Faid had been sleeping, indicating that he was prepared to fight if he had the chance. The arrest was celebrated by the authorities as a victory for the rule of law. The Interior Minister praised the investigators for their patience and precision. Following his capture, Faid was transferred to the Vendin-la-Ville prison, one of the most secure facilities in France. The conditions of his incarceration were significantly tightened. He was placed in solitary confinement with frequent cell changes and constant surveillance. The prison administration was determined to ensure that there would be no third escape. Every movement he made was watched by multiple guards, and his contact with the outside world was severely restricted. The trial for the escape began several years later in 2023. The courtroom was packed, with journalists and spectators eager to see the famous gangster. Faid appeared in the dock surrounded by masked special forces officers. He was charged with a litany of offenses, including hijacking, kidnapping, and organized escape. During the trial, Faid remained charismatic and defiant, often smiling at the cameras. He admitted to the escape, but tried to minimize the violence, claiming he never intended to hurt anyone. The pilot of the helicopter testified against Faid, describing the terror of the kidnapping. He spoke of the psychological trauma he suffered and the fear that he would be executed once he had served his purpose. His testimony painted a darker picture of the escape, contrasting with the romanticized version that Faid tried to present. The prosecution argued that Faid was a ruthless criminal who treated people as disposable pawns in his games. They sought a severe sentence to deter any future attempts. The defense team tried to argue that the prison conditions were inhumane and that the escape was an act of desperation. They portrayed Faid as a man who simply sought freedom regardless of the cost. However, the evidence was overwhelming. The planning, the weapons, and the hostage-taking were all clear indicators of a sophisticated criminal operation. The jury was not swayed by the charm of the defendant. They saw a dangerous man who had endangered countless lives. In the end, Redoine Faid was found guilty and sentenced to 14 years in prison for the escape. This was in addition to the long sentence he was already serving for the failed robbery in 2010 that resulted in the death of a policewoman. The additional years meant that Faid would likely spend the rest of his life behind bars. The judge emphasized the need to protect society from a man who had repeatedly shown a disregard for the law and public safety. The legacy of the helicopter escape had a profound impact on the French penal system. It exposed glaring vulnerabilities in the security of even the most modern prisons. Following the incident, the Ministry of Justice ordered an immediate review of all prison security measures. Anti-helicopter nets were installed in courtyards across the country, and security protocols for high-profile inmates were overhauled. The escape forced a modernization of prison defenses. The story also reignited the debate about the glorification of criminals in media. Faid's obsession with movies and his own celebrity status raised questions about how society views charismatic outlaws. While some viewed him as an anti-hero, fighting the system, others saw a violent narcissist. The media coverage of the escape was criticized for being too sensationalist and for turning a criminal act into a spectacle. Yet the public appetite for such stories remains insatiable. Today, Redoine Faid sits in a high-security cell, isolated from the world. He once roamed freely. His days of Hollywood-style heists and dramatic escapes are likely over. The walls are thicker, the guards are more vigilant, and the nets over the courtyards block the sky. But the legend of the helicopter escape persists. It remains a cautionary tale for the authorities and a source of fascination for those who study the criminal mind. It is a reminder that, with enough determination and planning, even the impossible can be achieved. As we look back on this event, it serves as a stark example of the cat and mouse game between law enforcement and organized crime. It highlights the constant evolution of criminal tactics and the need for authorities to stay one step ahead. The helicopter escape was a failure of security, but the subsequent investigation was a triumph of detective work. It showed that while a criminal might win the battle and escape the cage, the war is long, and the state has the resources to ensure that justice is eventually served. Ultimately, the story of Redoine Faid is a tragedy of wasted potential. A man with intelligence, charisma, and leadership skills chose to apply them to destruction rather than creation. He wrote his own script, but unlike the movies he loved, there was no happy ending. The credits have rolled, and the screen has gone dark, leaving him alone in a concrete box. The king of escape has finally run out of exits, leaving behind only the echo of rotor blades and a story that will be told for decades.